Yo, let's talk Assassination Rogue. The way I'm going to structure this guide will be in the following. We're going to first talk about our raid single target rotation, before then moving on to Mythic Plus in our AoE rotation. If you want to jump around, I will have timestamps below, so feel free to do so. So, single target talents. Our rogue class tree, nothing will ever change, so easy here, will always be the same no matter what fight you're doing. On the Deathstalker tree, our hero talent tree, similarly, nothing changes. Select the existing nodes and you run with that. It is worth mentioning, you can play Fatebound in single target, but the vast majority of people that raid right now don't do that, so for simplicity, I'm just not going to go into it. Play Deathstalker in all situations, and that will be good. Now, for raid, on the right-hand side here, this is like your pure single target build. This is no AoE, no cleave. You play this for doing maximum single targets on a fight like Sprocketmonger, for example. Now, pay attention to two particular talents. One is Internal Blading, and the other is Tiny Toxic Blade. The moment any number of adds exist on a fight, we're going to immediately drop Internal Bleeding in favor of Caustic. This is our add damage. And the way this works is it applies a debuff to the mob you're hitting. There are a few conditionals for it, but without going into too much detail, this ability should have 100% uptime if you're hitting off a boss. And this just causes 40% of your poison damage to splash off your main target to nearby enemies. Next, we can then drop Tiny Toxic Blade in favor of something like Arterial Precision. This makes it so that our Shiv can now hit 7 nearby additional targets, increasing bleed damage done by 30% for 8 seconds. We don't really care so much about the bleed damage increase. We more so are interested in the just straight up benefit that Shiv provides playing Assassination, which is that it increases the nature damage taken by the target by 30% for 8 seconds. And if this is hitting multiple targets, right, and you're hitting off the boss with Caustic Spatter, your Caustic Spatter damage will be hitting on those mobs harder. So those are the two talents you can swap between. Everything else remains the same. Next, let's talk our maintenance and basic rotation, and also we will touch on our hero talent tree. So Assassination Rogue is a dot class. You apply damage over time effects to your target. This includes, but is not limited to, Garrote. Okay, this is a builder. It generates 1 combo point, applies a bleed to the target, and Rupture. Okay, this is a finisher, meaning it consumes your combo points and applies a second bleed. Outside of Garrote and Rupture, we're going to Mutilate as our primary builder, and then Envenom as our primary finisher. Now, when you Envenom, you actually get a buff, which increases your poison application chance. One of the gameplay elements of Assassination used to be that we want to try and maximize this buff uptime. So we have debuffs we're trying to maximize, and buffs we also want to maximize. But this tier, especially with one of our talents, which you can see I have 2 bars here, and I'll occasionally have 2 stacks of Envenom. We play a talent called Twist the Knife, which causes our Envenom duration to increase by a couple seconds, and also enables overlapping Envenoms. This just makes it so that we really never have to think about actually tracking our Envenom uptime, because just baseline, if we're spamming abilities, it's going to be very high. So that is your baseline rotation. Now, regarding our hero talents, we're going to add one more kind of gameplay loop. So the way it works, we're going to Ambush to apply Deathstalker's Mark. This is our hero talent, and the way this works is that every time we use a finisher at 5 or more combo points, we consume 1 stack of the mark. And if you do that 3 times, you are awarded a Darkest Night proc. This makes it so that your next Envenom does extra damage and is guaranteed to crit, but you have to use a full combo point finisher to realize this Darkest Night proc. And then once you do that, you're awarded back your Deathstalker's marked. So this is kind of like a little gameplay loop, where you're doing 3 5 combo point finishers, followed by 7 combo point Darkest Night. So if I send a 6th one here, it won't consume it. Now, regarding our cooldowns, there's 3 buttons we need to think about. We have Death Mark. This is a 2-minute cooldown. Kingsbane, 1-minute cooldown, and Shiv, which we have 2 charges of on 30-second cooldown. What Deathmark does is it applies a bleed to your target, which causes all of your other bleeds and poisons to duplicate. Kingsbane is a poison dot, which deals upfront damage and then ramping damage over time, stacking up to 1000% increased damage. And then Shiv, we've already touched on, but this increases our nature damage to our target by 30%. The bleed damage additional effect here is from the talent I talked about earlier, Arterial Precision. So these three abilities all kind of complement each other, and thus we sort of want to use them all at the same time. And the way that works is like this. Focus on the last four, or these four globals here. When we have our 2-minute cooldown up, right, when Deathmark is available, we want to make sure we have 2 charges of Shiv, and our Kingsbane is also up. And we're going to go Envenom, Deathmark, Shiv, Kingsbane, in this order. This is because we're pretty much trying to prep our Kingsbane to ramp as fast as possible. Because Deathmark duplicating our poison applications means that our Kingsbane ramps quicker. This ramps based on the poison applications we apply to the mob we're hitting of our Kingsbane target. Then Shiv just increases the nature damage we deal. Kingsbane falls under nature damage. So I will showcase that real quick. Ambush the opener, get our bleeds up. Envenom, Deathmark, Shiv, Kingsbane, and we're in. Now at this point I'm doing my normal rotation, but once Shiv falls off, I'm going to then reapply it, refresh my bleed, and that's basically it. My CDs will expire, and at this point I'm just into my normal rotation. Now one thing worth noting, you send 2 Shivs in your first Deathmark window. The second Shiv you will send over the course of a 2-minute window is going to be when you have Darkest Night and Lingering Darkness. Going to build to max comp points and send Venom. Now I haven't talked about what Lingering Darkness is, so we'll get to that a little bit later. Then, after a minute has passed, and your Kingsbane comes off cooldown, we're going to send this Kingsbane similar to how we opened at the start of the fight, where we're going to want to Envenom first. Kingsbane, but this time we don't pre-Shiv, since we only have 1 charge, and Kingsbane is a ramping dot. We actually want to Shiv the end of its duration, because this is where Kingsbane is doing the most possible damage, so we're buffing that damage. And then from this point onwards, I would just be doing my normal rotation until Deathmark and Kingsbane come back up. I would have 2 charges of Shiv, and then we would repeat. Now regarding the Lingering Darkness thing, so it used to be the case that you would always send both your Shiv charges with your Kingsbane. So we send 2 in our Deathmark, and then you would also send 2 after 1 minute with your Kingsbane. But this year, it's actually a case that it's better to send what we call a dry Shiv. So this is a Shiv that's not buffing your Kingsbane on a Darkest Night proc with Lingering Darkness active. And this is a buff you get after your Deathmark expires. So essentially, once you have your Shiv charge come off cooldown, you have a Darkest Night proc, and you're in your Lingering Darkness window, you're going to press Shiv, build to max combo points, and use an Envenom. And the damage you get from like supercharging that Envenom ends up being more than if you were to send 2 Shivs during your 1-minute Kingsbane. And that's your rotation. You'll also notice Pot and Trinket here. Ideally, you play an on-use Trinket as Assassination. You can just macro it into your Deathmark. If you have a 2-minute Trinket, it's very simple, and that's when you want to use it. If you have Pot, use it right before you press Deathmark. And we also have another cooldown technically that I haven't talked about in Thistle T. The way this one works is that it awards you 100 energy and also gives you a chunk of mastery for 6 seconds when used. It turns out the best way to use this is just to press it whenever you use Shiv. So, simply put, just macro it to your Shiv and forget about it. That is what this slide depicts. Macro to Shiv. Okay, let's talk optimizations. So, number 1, plan ahead. Study fights. Now this might sound kind of lame, like, oh, Shindig, I just want to know how to play my spec better. I don't actually want to, like, do research. Well, I mean, if you're watching this video, I feel like you're already kind of down that rabbit hole, so I'm going to push you even further and suggest that you check out Lorgs, okay? What this website does is it shows you all of the major cooldown presses of the top performing rogues of your specialization. In this case, I have Assassination Rogue selected for all of the fights in the raid. So if you want to see what people are doing and like how they're doing as much damage as they are, this can be a very helpful resource. Because what ends up happening is that sometimes it's correct to just press your cooldowns on cooldown, but other times it's not necessarily correct, and you want to hold for different situations. So I'd encourage taking a look here. Trying to replicate what these top performing rogues are doing will do you a lot of good, and it can be a good exercise to try and understand why they may not be pressing their cooldowns on cooldown, as that will kind of teach you more about the spec and how to sort of optimize your damage going forward into future encounters. But things you would typically look for setting your cooldowns would involve ad spawns, okay? That's a hint here. Damage amps, and also fight length, right? How long do you expect the fight to last? As an example, whether the fight is 6 minutes long or 5 minutes long, that's not going to change the total number of death mark presses you get over the course of a fight. As a result, it may end up being correct to hold death mark and not set it on cooldown in certain situations. Alright, next. Pool energy for Kingsbane. So this is really the only instance of pooling energy that's super meaningful. Outside of this, you can pretty much just spam and be completely fine. But when our Kingsbane is coming off cooldown, especially our 1 minute Kingsbane, and when I say 1 minute KB, I'm referring to when Deathmark is on cooldown. So we're not sending them together, it's just Kingsbane. It is correct to stop pressing globals like 3 to 5 seconds out from your Kingsbane to pool before then pressing it and going into spamming again. Next, Rupture Sniping is good, just don't overcap energy. Okay, what is Rupture Sniping? So this refers to the act of rupturing non-boss targets, and the intent is that you're doing so to gain energy. Now, the way this works is you have a talent called Venomous Wounds. This makes it so that whenever you have ruptures out, well, Garrotes as well, but ruptures are the one we care about, every tick gains you 8 energy, and then when an enemy dies with your rupture afflicted, you'll receive the energy you would have gained over the course of that duration. Now, if that's confusing, all you need to know is that rupturing ads, even if they don't live very long, equals big energy. So whenever you have the opportunity to rupture several ads, you generally want to do so, as long as you can fully realize the energy that rupture provides you. Right, so toss a couple ruptures out, and they also don't have to be like max comp point ruptures either. The idea is more so that you just want to toss enough out to enable you to continue spamming globals without running out of energy. But the moment you overcap energy, you've spent too much time applying ruptures, and you'd be better off just hitting your main target and hitting it then. Also, I wanted to point out something here. You'll notice that when I'm applying these ruptures, I am not having to use a builder to get combo points back. And I'm also not sending 5 or more combo point ruptures into the non-primary target in this makeshift situation. And the reason for that is that when you're rupture sniping, it's not necessarily important that you slam out max combo point ruptures on non-boss enemies, because the energy you get from using rupture is linear, so it's not overly important that these ruptures you're throwing out are max in combo points or close to max. Also, you'll notice that I didn't have to use a builder between each of the rupture casts, and this is due to a talent called Serrated Bone Spike. Now, the way this works is that prior to going to combat, we have 3 charges of Serrated Bone Spike. And when we use Rupture, we will apply one of those charges. After which point, the next time you apply Rupture, it will try to apply a Serrated Bone Spike again. But if your target already has one, then it just won't do anything. Okay? So in a boss fight, when ads spawn, you should effectively have 1 Bone Spike on the boss, and then 2 more stored Bone Spikes. When you then apply Rupture to a non-boss enemy, you are applying a new Bone Spike and then being refunded additional combo points due to the secondary effect that you are awarded a combo point plus additional combo points for each Bone Spike you have out. So when I apply my second Rupture here, I have 1 Bone Spike on the boss target, 1 on the second target, so I get 1 plus 2 combo points, which is 3. And then when I apply the third rupture, that's 1 combo point plus now 3 bone spikes. That's 4 combo points. So if you apply ruptures in quick succession, you actually don't have to use a builder. Finally, Phantom Knives in 5 targets or with a Clear the Witness proc plus Lingering. Phantom Knives is our AoE builder. You actually saw me pressing it just now. Whenever there are 5 or more targets with your raid build, it's actually a better global to use Fan as your main builder instead of Mutilate. Now there are a bunch of conditionals attached to this. I have an image from the Ravenhold Discord. This is the Rogue Discord, which is, by the way, also a super helpful resource I would highly recommend. In general, Phantom Knives in 5 targets with the raid build, or you press Phantom Knives in single target when you have a Clear the Witness proc and Lingering Darkness. So we've touched on what Lingering Darkness is, right? It's increased our nature damage by 30%. Clear the Witness is another hero talent interaction, and this occurs after we send a Darkest Night. But let's say we're doing like a single target encounter, for example. And I just do my cooldown rotation here. Here the Witness procs end up actually being more damaging. It's this proc right here, such that when you have a proc, you want to actually use Phantom Knives, even in single target. Now, I have a weak core pack that tells me, that kind of answers that conditional for me. So it'll check if I have Lingering Darkness and Clear the Witness, and if I have both up. Also, here's my dry shiv, by the way. I should have shivved a little bit earlier. It will then tell me to use Phantom Knives. But on the other hand, if I don't have Lingering Darkness up, so I'll consume this next Darkest Night, prompting a Clear the Witness proc. It doesn't show my Clear the Witness proc, but it's just up here. This weak core pack is helpful. It has that logic built in. Also, if you want any of the weak cores I use, they're all in my Discord. You can find it in the description below. Okay, we'll get to this in a second, but one more thing I want to cover that I haven't talked about, just briefly. On the class tree side of things, we run a talent called Supercharger and Force Induction. If you've seen my sub-guide, you'll know how this works. But with Assassination, anytime you press Shiv, it will supercharge your next 2 finishers. Okay, I'm just going to showcase that real quick. And with both Supercharger and Force Induction talented, it makes your finishers act as if there are +3 combo points. So this 4 combo point finisher would be a 7-1 by pressing Venom. Then this 7 combo point finisher will act as a 10 combo point finisher with this Darkest Night. This doesn't really change the way you play your rotation, but it can. And what do I mean by that? So let's just say I Shiv right now. Okay, I have a Darkest Night proc, so in order to consume this Darkest Night, I would usually need to send a 7 combo point finisher. But because I have a Supercharger proc, which acts as +3 combo points, this acts as a 7 combo point finisher right now. So it's 4 + 3, which is 7, which will consume my Darkest Night. Okay, and the same thing is true for your Deathstalker's Mark. You had 2 combo points with Shiv up. This would be a 5 combo point finisher. So you could, if you wanted to, Envenom there, but it's not meaningfully different. Alright, for stats, we like Agility, Mastery, Crit, Haste Verse, kind of in that order for a single target. If I were to add weapon damage here, aka your main hand weapon damage, it actually goes in front of Agility, and it's like quite significantly better. So your biggest gearing DPS gain will come from your main hand weapon. And to clarify, that is only your main hand weapon. Okay, weapon damage from your offhand doesn't matter. So getting a big main hand online early will probably be your immediate biggest DPS upgrade. Outside of that, I mean, you can use these stat weights, but this is just a loose reference point. The best thing is to always sim for yourself. Go on raid bots, open up Top Gear, and compare any items you get, any upgrades you might get, to see in much greater certainty what items are good for you. Then I have a list of enchants and consumables that you want to use. A quick note, I pulled these images off of Wowhead. I also pulled this one off of Wowhead. The Assassination Rogue guide on Wowhead is very good. Okay, if there's anything after watching this video that you're unclear about, that you want to learn more about, I would highly encourage you check it out. It's a very helpful resource. The guide writer Whisper is super knowledgeable, so definitely take a look. Now, one more thing I forgot to cover that I do want to quickly mention. I have this picture here, and you might be like, well, what is this? So If we're talented into Caustic Spatter, the way this talent works is it causes our poison damaging abilities to splash to nearby targets. Baseline, there's a 12-yard range around the mob you're hitting, around the mob that has Caustic applied to it, in which your damage will splash to nearby enemies. But one thing that kind of sucked about this on Gallywix in particular is that when he would fly to the middle of the platform and sit in like his little hole, that 12-yard radius was like literally the hole. So it was almost impossible for your Caustic to cleave on any of the ads this fight, which meant Assassination was like not doing too hot early on. So Blizzard implemented a change to Caustic, making it so that there's now a 12-yard check around the boss and your character, as long as it's within melee range of the boss. So this red circle is 12 yards around the boss, this yellow circle is melee range, and then the blue circle is like your 12-yard check. So as long in the overlap between your character and melee range of the boss, your Caustic will kind of extend. This can be helpful to know because ideally if there are ads out, you position with the ads between you and the boss so that you guarantee they are being hit by Caustic. Now, in general, you're probably already going to do that because if there are 5 or more of them, you want to have knives, and that requires you being near your targets. But I thought it was helpful to know, so I'm sharing it with you now. Alrighty, let's talk Mythic Plus in our AoE rotation. In M Plus right now, there are sort of 3 different talent builds you can run, depending on the dungeon, depending on the group comp, depending on a variety of factors. And these talent builds are the following. I will get into each of them in a little bit, but for starters, let's talk about your playstyle for all builds. Going into an AoE pool, there's sort of 3 steps we want to think about. We want to apply bleeds, pick out a prio target, and go. So for the first step, applying bleeds, you receive a variety of stealth benefits from your talent tree. Things like Master Assassin, increasing crit chance, improved Garrote, increasing Garrote damage, indiscriminate carnage. This causes our Garrotes and Ruptures to cleave, hitting our main target plus 2 others. And these effects will persist for a duration after we leave stealth. So, immediately upon leaving stealth, we want to utilize this duration to apply bleeds to the pack. Alright, so I sent all my Garrotes and Ruptures are out, Crimson Tempest. At this point, I've completed step 1, okay? My bleeds are out in the pool. Now, going into a new pack coming out of stealth, you pretty much always want to get at least 2 Rupture casts off, okay? This will give you at least 5 different Ruptures, assuming there are up to 5 mobs in the pool. And this gives you maximum stacks of your Scent of Blood. Any additional Ruptures and Garrotes beyond this, you're just pressing for damage, which can be good to do so. Coming out of stealth, Garrote is generally your best builder. But the duration that you have to apply these bleeds will depend on the spec you're playing, so we'll talk more on that later. Next, you're going to pick out a prio target. To be fair, you kind of already want to have an idea of what your prio target is before you go into the pool, because if it's the first pool of the dungeon, we'll need to ambush a high health prio target to apply our Deathstalker's Mark. Say this guy has the highest health. We then want to apply our blades. And then we want to mutilate off our prio mob. This applies Caustic Spatter. We've talked about this before. And in AoE, this makes up a fairly sizable amount of our damage profile with splash damage to other mobs. So, 2 things you want to think about regarding your prio target. 1, if you don't already have a Darkest Night, you want to ambush your prio mob to apply your hero talents, and you want to eventually mutilate, once Rupture is applied, to apply your Caustic. And as you're doing your AoE rotation, right, so there are 5 mobs here, I would usually use Fan of Knives as my primary builder, but before my Caustic Spatter falls off, I want to mutilate again. Okay, so I'm trying to maintain this. And then the final step is go. Now, once you've applied all of your bleeds, you picked out a prio target, right, so you've applied your hero talents, you also have Caustic up. The go step just refers to doing your normal rotation. So I'll showcase that here. I'm playing Kingsbane in this build, so once I have all my bleeds up, have my Caustic up, I'm then going to Venom, Deathmark, Kingsbane, and we're into our normal rotation. Maintaining Caustic, maintaining our bleeds, and cycling through our hero talents. All right, now to talk about further specificity, we need to break down each of the different talent builds. And let's start with Hybrid to Vanish. All right, so this build has kind of been grandfathered in from last season. The same is true for this and the Force Induction build, where we're running this sort of hybrid damage profile with Kingsbane and some bleed damage benefits. All right, so when playing this build, I kind of like to think of your bleeds as being energy and damage. Now, we can look here to see exactly what our damage breakdown looks like. If you have no idea what you're looking at, this is just a feature on raid bots. I did a Dungeon Slice sim with this specialization. Now, all that Dungeon Slice is it's kind of like a small makeshift Mythic Plus environment type sim. So at its core, it's a 2-minute boss fight followed by various sized pulls and restelts. You can kind of see that here, right? Boss fight followed by various target count pulls, restelts, so on and so forth. And regarding our damage sources, we see a big chunk of that is coming from our Caustic Spatter and Envenom, right? This is our magic damage portion, our nature damage portion, but we're still getting a lot of benefit from Crimson Tempest, Garrote, Rupture, right, our bleeds. So the takeaway here is that there's a good mix of the two damage types, and as a result, the following then is that target swapping for bleeds is good, but not required. Okay, so what do I mean by this? Well, the way Indiscriminate Carnage works is that when I Garrote and Rupture off of one mob, it'll apply those bleeds to that current mob, plus 2 others in the pool that don't yet have bleeds. All right, so if there are 5 mobs in the pool, I can Garrote my current mob. It applies to 2 others, and then there's only 2 mobs remaining that don't have Garrote. So if I just Garrote my current target again, it'll reapply to my current target plus 2 others. So I actually don't have to target swap. But in 6 targets, if I were to do that same thing and Garrote twice off the same mob, I would lose 1 Garrote, right? Like there would be 1 mob that doesn't have it. So to fix that, ideally, you would go into a pool, you'd Garrote off your current mob, and then you would want to target swap and Garrote off something different. This way, because I'm Garroting a mob that doesn't already have it, plus 2 others in the pool that don't have it, with Indiscriminate Carnage, I'm effectively throwing out more bleeds. So that global becomes more valuable. So when you're playing hybrid, this is an optimization to improve your damage, but it's not terribly important, okay? And in many target pools, it can become quite disruptive trying to click through all the nameplates to Garrote all the different mobs, and then make your way back to your proud target, wherever that may happen to be. So if you find you're unable to navigate your nameplates effectively, or as you're swapping through targets, you're no longer pressing abilities on cooldown, aka you start to delay your rotation, you are then much better off just not worrying about target swapping. So if you're to ask me whether I target swap, for the most part, it's going to be situation dependent. I try to, but there are also times that I will recognize that I am unable to target swap efficiently, and thus I just bleed off the same target. Now, there are some things you can do to make that process a bit easier. I use mouse over macros for both my Garrote and my Rupture. Personally, I found it easier playing with mouse over macros. Now, you don't have to use them. They also come with their own sort of detriments and problems, so it's not really like a one-size-fits-all solution. There are some other ways around it, but to avoid going into too much detail, target swapping is good, but you don't have to do it, especially if you're learning the spec for the first time. Next, ambush Proud Mob within 6 seconds of leading stealth if no Darkest Night. Okay, so if we're going into a pull and we do not have a Darkest Night proc, we have to ambush to apply our hero talents, okay? Now, one benefit to this build, in particular playing Subterfuge, is that you do not have to ambush as your first global, okay? So I could instead, for instance, do something like this. All right, so I Garrote, Rupture into an ambush. This applied my mark, and it also applied my caustic. So rather than separating those things into 2 different steps, I can actually condense it into one as long as I press that ambush within 6 seconds, okay? If I delay it too long, so let's say I leave stealth here, I'm applying my bleeds, 6 seconds has passed, that ambush is no longer available. And I would either have to Vanish to ambush again, or I just do that pull without my hero talents, which is a sizable DPS loss. So try to make sure you apply them going into a pull. And if you're not confident, you can, remember to apply it after you do your bleeds, and just ambush first global. That is completely fine. Next, Vanish for Master Assassin in cooldowns, plus reapply bleeds. So with this build, we actually run Master Assassin. This increases our critical strike chance by 20% coming out of stealth. And so the way this works with your cooldowns, my Vanish is on cooldown, so I can't really show that right now. When you go into your cooldowns, you'd press Deathmark, Kingsbane with all your bleeds out, and you would want to Vanish the last 12 seconds of your Deathmark and Kingsbane to buff it. Sort of like how we shiv in single target, you're using Vanish the same way for your Master Assassin buff. Now additionally, something you can do while Vanished, since you gain access to Indiscriminate Carnage, is you can utilize this Vanish window to refresh any of your existing bleeds, which typically, if you go into a pull with cooldowns and you use bleeds in the opener, a lot of those bleeds will be beginning to fall off, especially your Garrotes. So using your Indiscriminate Carnage or IC window to refresh your bleeds is another good use of your Vanish. So I'll show what that looks like. Okay, 12 seconds left. I'm going to Vanish. I notice some of my growth's starting to fall off. My caustic's falling off. I'm going to mouse over Garrote a couple. I need to refresh my Darkest Night. Refresh Crimson Tempest. Right. And that's sort of the idea. Additionally, with this build, you actually have 2 Vanish charges. So what are we doing with the second Vanish charge? Well, use it somewhere during a chain pull, during prolonged combat, or solve mechanic. Typically, earlier in the dungeon is better. That way you can utilize the double Vanish cooldown. And what I mean by that is, oftentimes with your Death Mark, you're not pressing it on cooldown over the course of a Mythic Plus dungeon, because maybe it comes off cooldown in between packs, right? So instead of pressing it every 2 minutes, it ends up being on average more like every 2 minute, 10 seconds. What that means then, if you only press one Vanish with your Death Mark and you don't use Vanish anywhere else, your Vanish is going to be sitting at 2 charges for some portion of the dungeon. And this is technically a DPS loss, because you're not utilizing your 2 charges of Vanish, where if you had used both Vanish charges, right, I see I have cooldowns coming back up right now, I'm farming back a second Vanish charge while I wait to go into my cooldown window. So try to use your second Vanish at some point earlier in the dungeon, so that you can then spend the rest of the dungeon farming back that Vanish charge for a later point in the key. Then finally, use Shiv in less than 5 mobs, so 4 or less. Now, you'll notice that when I did my cooldowns, I didn't press Shiv. In AoE, without Arterial Precision, Shiv only increases the nature damage you deal to your current target. It does not increase the damage to other targets. So what that entails is that Shiv is really only a prio damaging ability, and beyond 4 targets, the global is just no longer worth it. So in AoE, we don't really press Shiv. Alright, next. Let's talk Forced Induction. We drop Master Assassin in favor of Twist the Knife, and we're going to drop the right side of our hero talent tree in favor of the middle talent nodes here. Now with your talent choices being so similar, this build does play quite similar, but there are a few key differences that I want to touch on. So firstly, with this build, bleeds are energy. Think of your bleeds as providing energy for you to spam abilities during a pull. So here's another Dungeon Slice Sim, this time as Forced Induction. And here we can see, looking at our damage breakdown, that Caustic and Venom are making up a similarly large part of our damage profile, right, comparatively. And Venom is slightly greater, where our bleeds, namely Rupture and Garrote, are making up much less of our damage. 8.5%, 8.8% versus 6.9% and 7.6%. Maybe much less is an exaggeration, but we're leaning more heavily into our magic damaging abilities. Now, you might notice that Crimson Tempest in this build is dealing slightly more damage, but the only reason for that is because this build generally does less damage in AoE. As such, Crimson Tempest ends up making up a larger part of your damage profile relative to the other relative to this build, for instance. Yo, editing shindigs here. I needed to add a post-edit clip here because I make the claim during this discussion that the Force Induction variant does less overall relative to the hybrid double Vanish. And I'm drawing that conclusion based on the sim values that I show with these two Dungeon Slice sims, which is fine, but there's a problem. The issue is that assassination AoE sims aren't working correctly. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail now. I'm going to have an additional segment later in the video that covers it in a bit more depth. So now I could have just removed this segment entirely, and maybe I still will. I'm not really sure yet. But the reason I've left it in is because I think the discussion regarding where your damage is playing the two different builds is important, and it's helpful to know, regardless of what the actual value that the sim is returning shows. Anyways, because we're leaning more heavily into our nature damaging abilities, think of bleeds as providing you energy. As such, you do not need to target swap to apply your bleeds, or at least it is the least important to do so when you're playing this build. This can be a pretty big quality of life improvement, especially if you struggle target swapping or using mouse over macros. But you do need to ambush as your first global if no Darkest Night. And that is because without Subterfuge, the moment we leave stealth, we lose access to ambush. So going into a pull, if you don't have Darkest Night, you have to ambush as your first global, which means picking out the proud target and going from there. Another difference in this build when compared to hybrid is that we no longer need to vanish for cooldowns. Because we're not talented into Master Assassin, Vanish is less of an immediate damaging cooldown and more so kind of a way to either get resources in the sense that we're applying bleeds and getting energy, right? Bleeds are energy, or we're using it to solve some mechanic in the dungeon. And the final point here is that you are an Envenom bot, right? So once you've applied your bleeds, you just want to slam Envenoms into your caustic target. And with this build, it's actually correct to shiv in less than 9 targets. And this is because with Supercharger and Force Induction, our shivs supercharging our Venoms make that a much more lucrative global, even though shiv only applies to our current target. So just to showcase what that rotation might look like, it would go like this. Ambush first, apply our bleeds. Get our caustic up, go into our cooldowns. Now in this case, we are not going to vanish because there's not really any benefit right now, but we will shiv in the last 8 seconds to gain Supercharger, consume our Darkest Night, refresh Crimson Tempest, and in this case, if this were a prolonged pull, I can maybe vanish to refresh my Garrotes. But that would pretty much be the sole purpose of doing so. All right, let's talk single target. So with both of these builds, there are a few things you want to pay attention to. Stay under 150 energy. That is because with both these builds, we are talented into Sanguine Blades, which pretty dramatically increases your AoE damage in many target pulls. But in single target, the damage gain you get from being above 50% energy ends up being less than the damage you get from just slamming Envenoms below 50% energy. And just like our raid build, we want to pool to around 150 energy before pressing Kingsbane. Also, in single target, we want to use Fan of Knives with Clear the Witness. This is true for all builds, by the way. We talked about this earlier. Whenever you have a Clear the Witness proc, it is always better to press Fan of Knives over Mutilate, even in single target, in any situation. And then I mentioned this before in cooldowns, but use Shiv for your last 8 seconds of Kingsbane, and then on cooldown. Now, because we don't have 2 charges of Shiv, in order to fully utilize this ability in single target, it is very important we are pressing it the moment it comes off cooldown if we want to fit in a dry Shiv, which is your Shiv between Kingsbanes. If you end up delaying it at any point between Kingsbane windows, you end up risking desyncing it from your Kingsbane, which will be a greater damage loss. So make sure you're pressing this on cooldown, and if at any point you notice it gets out of sync from your Kingsbane, you're better off just holding, sitting on a charge, and lining it back up with your next Kingsbane Breath. Alright, some tips. Use Kingsbane on CD, avoid desyncing from Deathmark. So, one thing that can be awkward in Mythic Plus when you're playing Kingsbane is that because it's a 1 minute cooldown, Deathmark is a 2 minute cooldown, And in general, in order to do the maximum amount of damage over the course of Mythic Keystone, we want to press our cooldowns as much as possible, but you can't always do that, right? Maybe your Kingsbane comes off cooldown and you're running to the next pull. What this means is that often you can end up desyncing your Deathmark from your Kingsbane, in the sense that you use Deathmark and Kingsbane together, you press Kingsbane like a minute and 20 seconds later, and then after 2 minutes, oh snap, my Deathmark's up, but I don't have Kingsbane to pair with it. You know, what do I do then? Well, the answer is that you end up having to sit on your Deathmark. You're not supposed to press it without Kingsbane, so you just have to wait until Kingsbane comes off cooldown, and you can then press them together. Sometimes it's out of your control, right? If you're between pulls, there's nothing you can do. However, if a pull is just about to die, what you can do, Kingsbane just came off cooldown, Deathmark is 1 minute away, and you know that you want to press Deathmark as soon as possible. What you can do is just Kingsbane some low health mob in that pull, right? You're not really utilizing your Kingsbane this way because the mob's going to die pretty quickly. You're not really able to get your damage out, but you're guaranteeing that your Kingsbane comes off cooldown with your Deathmark, so you can use your Deathmark on cooldown. And comparatively, your Deathmarked Kingsbane, so using these two abilities together, is a lot more damage than just using your Kingsbane. However, there will also be situations where it's correct not to do that, in the sense that you would rather save Kingsbane for a new pull, desync these cooldowns, and then just sit on your Deathmark for however long to resync your Kingsbane. Maybe you know that when your Deathmark comes up, there's some RP you have to do, you have to run to another pull, so you're not actually losing the value out of this Deathmark, because there's nothing you could send it on anyways. So, understanding when it's best to use your cooldowns will be something that you learn as you do Mythic Plus and get more experience playing keys. Well, those are some things you can think about to hopefully help inform that decision. Alright, next. If Shiv gets delayed in single target, hold for Kingsbane. I've talked about this already, so I'm going to skip it. Next, Fan of Knives in 2 or more targets. Only press Mutilate to refresh your Caustic at that point. And then Crimson Tempest in 2 or more targets. Crimson Tempest deals more damage the more mobs you hit. And with this build and when you're playing Hybrid, if it's hitting up to 2 targets, it becomes worth pressing. So don't press it in single target, but press it everywhere outside of that. Next, Bleed build. This build takes double Vanish, so the right side of your class tree here, and we actually drop all of the middle nodes in favor of the left and right nodes. And this is just turbo buffing our bleed damage, which is my first point here. Bleeds are damage. Opening up another Dungeon Slice sim, we see here that our damage breakdown is quite different, right? Crimson Tempest, Garrote, and Rupture all making up a much larger percentage than the other Mythic Plus builds. The trade-off here being that our nature damage, so our caustic and venom damage, is much less, okay? Now, when you're playing bleed build, you should be target swapping for bleeds. Because our bleeds are making up the largest relative portion of our damage, it is the most important playing this build to prioritize applying Garrotes and Ruptures. Next, we ambush a Prowl Mob within 6 seconds of leaving stealth, if no Darkest Night. I'm going to skip this one because I covered this when talking about Hybrid. Fan of Knives in 3 or more targets. So this is slightly different from the other 2 builds we looked at. And that's because when you're playing Bleed, you're going to run a talent called Blindside. Blindside makes it so that your Mutilates have a chance to proc a free ambush, which makes your Mutilates a slightly better ability to press. Another change rotationally, and this is probably the biggest one here, is that we're going to press Shiv after using Crimson Tempest. Then try to always keep on cooldown to utilize 2 charges. So, what does that look like? So my opener is very similar. I'm going to 5 Blades in the pull. Fingered Cloak, that's good. Get my Deathstalker's Mark out, apply Caustic, Crimson Tempest out, and now I'm going to Shiv, okay? And I can press Deathmark here as well as go to my cooldowns. I'm going to Vanish for my cooldowns, refresh some of my Garrotes here, they're falling off, refresh my Shiv, try to have full Shiv uptime during my Deathmark. And we're doing this to utilize arterial precision, right? We now have AoE Shiv. We can Shiv up to 8 targets in a pull, causing them to take increased nature and bleed damage. So in the opener, after we've applied Garrotes and Ruptures through Indiscriminate Carnage and our Crimson Tempest, it's a good time to press Shiv. I also make a note here, try to always keep on cooldown to utilize 2 charges.
The idea here is the same as what I was talking about before with Vanish. We have 2 charges of this ability. With Shiv, it's a much shorter cooldown, meaning it's a lot easier to kind of overcap and sit at 2 charges. So try to make sure you always put this ability on cooldown, or at least you have 1 charge on cooldown. And then typically when you go into a new pull, it's a good idea to have 1 Shiv charge saved. Then Vanish for Master Assassin and cooldowns plus reapply bleeds. I showcased this already, but with bleed build, we're back playing Master Assassin. So we want to utilize one of our Vanish charges in our cooldowns. Now we don't have Kingsbane, but we do still have Deathmark, which is much less kind of impactful as a AoE damaging ability, but it's great for prow damage, and it is one of our cooldowns, so typically we want to Vanish to further empower it. And then use your second Vanish charge for a chain pull or prolonged combat. Now, in single target, when you're playing the bleed build, we follow a slightly different rule set. We actually want to stay above 50% energy or 150. And this is because with bleed build, your Sanguine Blades are actually more damage than your Envenom. Additionally, we're going to Crimson Tempest in single targets. Again, our Envenom in this build is a lot weaker because we're skipping a lot of the middle damaging nodes. And so it turns out that Crimson Tempest, even in single targets, when it's not buffed by hitting other targets, is still a better finisher to use than Envenom. Then use 2 charges of Shiv with Deathmark, send other 2 wherever. When our Deathmark is coming off cooldown, this is our big damage window, especially in single target. We want to make sure we're pairing 2 Shiv charges with our Deathmark, similar to what we did when you were playing the raid build. And then the other 2 Shiv charges you have over the course of that 2-minute window, you can kind of just press wherever. All right, next, stat weights. So, Hybrid and Force Induction, these are the Kingsbane builds. Agi is basically your best stat. At higher gear levels, this actually ends up not being the case. So when your eye level is high enough, your secondaries end up being more impactful than your primary stat. Such that you would consider using like a Beladar's Bounty over a primary stat feast. But for simplicity, especially if you're gearing up, you can just think of agility as being your best stat. And then typically it goes mastery, crit are like your 2 best stats by far, followed by a verse, and then haste is your worst stat. Haste is good for you in single target, and it's bad in literally every other situation outside of that. So because often in Mythic Plus, the vast majority of dungeons you're not doing just pure single target, we're going to run as little haste as possible. Now with bleed build on the other hand, it's a little bit of a different story. Mastery is still your best stat, but crit actually loses some value to haste and verse, but the notable one here is haste. Haste is actually good for bleed build in single target, much like the hybrid and force induction build, but also in mass AoE. And the reason for that is kind of interesting. So because our bleeds are doing the vast majority of our damage, we really want Sanguine Blades uptime. But Sanguine Blades requires that we stay above 50% energy. And one of the properties of haste is that it gives us more energy regen. So haste actually helps to combat some of your loss in Sanguine Blades uptime. And in mass AoE, this ends up simming like pretty highly. Now, there are also probably some other things that I'm not covering that contribute to haste being like a meaningful secondary stat. For instance, off the top of my head, haste does increase the tick rate of our bleeds. And with our damage profile playing this build being baked more heavily into our bleeds, right, that's probably more impactful. But all in all, that just makes haste a more valuable stat. So bleed build kind of takes a bit of every secondary stat. But always sim for yourself. So, okay, we've covered each of the different Mythic Plus builds. Let's talk damage comparison. So I have 3 links here I'm going to pull up on screen. These are 3 logs I did playing each of the 3 different builds. We have a Mechagon and 2 Floodgates, I believe. So let's start with Bleed since it's the most recent thing we talked about. But if you go to our damage profile here, you will see our overall breakdown for the key. Most notably, pay attention to the percent contribution from our bleeds, right? Crimson Tempest, 20%. Rupture, 15%. Sanguine Blades, 12%. Garrote, 8%. When compared with something like Hybrid Double Vanish, you're going to notice that these bleeds are making up a much smaller part of our damage. Crimson Tempest, 15%, down from 20. Rupture, 15%. All right. Well, this rupture is 12%, down from 15. Sanguine Blades, 8%, down from 12.3. Garrote, 6.5%, down from 8.6. So bleed build, you're moving a lot more of your damage into your bleeds and dropping your caustic and venom damage, right? And venom here was 6%, caustic 13, versus with hybrid, caustic is 20% and venom is 12. So you're sort of shifting your damage profile when you go from playing bleed to playing hybrid. And then force induction here, I didn't have a, I haven't played this in a floodgate, so this isn't the best comparison because this dungeon is a little bit different. But you can see here, Envenom and Caustic are our highest damaging abilities playing Force Induction. That makes sense. With this build, our bleeds are energy. They should make up the smallest portion of our damage relative to the other builds. Now, another thing I want to point out here is that when we're playing bleed build, and by having a lot more of our damage baked into our bleeds, that means our sudden demise damage, which is kind of like an execute effect, right? This occurs when targets that have bleeds applied to them have health remaining that is less than 150% of the damage your bleeds would do to that target. They'll just die. And when we prioritize more of our bleed damage, this ends up being a larger pop playing this build. And you can see that here. So this is the floodgate, right? 3.5% versus with hybrid build, the sudden demise damage less than 1%. Also, it's worth noting there's no way to measure sudden demise damage in sims, as they just can't accurately depict it. So whenever you're simming for something, take that into consideration. Additionally, and speaking of sims, that brings us to the strengths and weaknesses of each of the different builds, simmed with values jotted down. Or at least, that's what this table was supposed to indicate. Turns out, rogue assassination sims have a major problem. Namely, force induction builds just straight up are not simming correctly in AoE. Or at least, that's what we think. But more on that later. Bleed and hybrid double vanish, on the other hand, seem to sim fine, and we can see how these two builds perform at different target counts. With single target being relatively equal, bleed happened to edge in front in this case, but they kind of go back and forth. But they're both similarly not great. Then in 3 to 6 target, bleed is noticeably behind, and from 8 targets up, they kind of even out. And the dungeon slice sim ends up returning fairly similar values as well. So from this, it's reasonable to deduce that hybrid double vanish is stronger in 3 to 6 targets, whereas bleed tends to kind of even things out at higher target counts. So what about force induction? Why is it the case that sims aren't portraying it correctly? It seems on here that it just performs worse the more targets you add. Which also kind of makes sense, right? Because when we're playing force induction, we're dropping the right side tree, so we don't have subterfuge. We also don't have master assassin, right? Compared to the other builds, we're losing that 12 seconds of 20% crit. We don't have a longer window to apply more garrotes, more ruptures efficiently through indiscriminate carnage. Like, okay, that seems reasonable. It seems like it would be the case that force induction would fall off at higher target counts. Well, not exactly. There's actually some weird stuff going on. And it's funny because I wrote this slide foreshadowing this point, and now I'm having to later come back and revisit it to re-explain this. Because it turns out that these sims, past a certain number of targets, are just not reliable. And I can give an example of that. So 2 links here. I'm going to pull them up on my other monitor here. All right, so we have a hybrid double vanish sim, 1 minute, 10 targets. And we also have a force induction sim here, 1 minute, 10 targets. Now, if we just look at the big number, that's a 3 mil difference. Hybrid double vanish clearly must be the better specialization in AoE. So that's your takeaway, and was a lot of people's takeaway, mine included for a large part of the season. You might think to yourself, great, we're chilling. Well, not exactly. If we scroll down here, there's a bunch of information that is available to you in a sim. You can get a more detailed report if you go to here, HTML report. Shows you a big breakdown of all different abilities, the DPS distribution over the course of many thousands of sims. And we've looked at this before. So what this rotation down here is showing is just one sample out of that big batch of sims. And this one sample, or one iteration, generally gives us a reasonable idea of what we can expect in a 1 minute sim, right? We start the poll applying all of our bleeds in our indiscriminate carnage window, followed by Crimson Tempest. We're then going to Envenom, go into cooldowns. We use Vanish to refresh our Master Assassin buff. And at this point, we're sending Envenoms into our Deathmark target. And then Garroting is our primary builder, refreshing a lot of our old Garrotes at this point. And that all makes sense, right? So what about the Force Induction build? What is it doing? Well, let's check it out. We're going to scroll down here. We see we open with bleeds. We're going to get some Garrotes out, double Rupture, that all makes sense, Crimson Tempest. And we're then going to individually Rupture a bunch of things. So, okay, the sim is prioritizing applying Ruptures over going into cooldowns and pressing Envenom. I mean, maybe that makes sense. I would sort of think if the sim wanted to apply more Ruptures than, the initial 2 that it did in its indiscriminate carnage window, it would probably press Vanish and then do that, which it does just a bit later. It then presses Rupture again. So, okay, this is all kind of weird, but whatever. Maybe this is actually a more optimized way to do the opener that, I'm not privy to. Whatever. Let's go down here. We see it goes into cooldowns. Yep, Envenom, Deathmark, Kingsbane. And then we Rupture? That's right. We're not going to ramp our Kingsbane with further Envenoms. We are instead going to Rupture all the mobs in the pack again. And refresh our Crimson Tempest, of course. And so seeing this confuses me, right? We don't even hit max stacks of our Kingsbane by the time it ends. We haven't fully ramped it. Because, well, we're not pressing any Envenoms. So this means one of two things. Either what the sim is doing is largely optimal, and the way I and everyone else has been playing Assassination is wrong. And sometimes sims will discover things that players haven't thought of, and then we implement that into our playstyle. Or the sim is just cooked. And pretty much the consensus I've reached, and what the rest of the community has sort of come to an agreement on, is that Force Induction sims in AoE, aka multi-target patchwork, are just not working as intended. This means I can't really compare them. And if we can't compare them, it's sort of impossible to know what build is the best. However, what I did find, and I made a new graph here, a new table, was that the sims seem to maintain more recognizable behavior up to 5 targets. At 6 or more is when we started to see some weird Rupture happenings in our cooldowns, among other things. So this at least gives us something, and the trends we see here are largely the same as what we saw before. I did put an asterisk next to Dungeon Slice, because while I was able to pick out and showcase a known issue with the Patchwork sim, I haven't really been able to see that in Dungeon Slice. Although at its core, Dungeon Slice is a single target boss fight, followed by varying target count AoE pulls. So I'm not sure if the behavior we see in the Patchwork sim translates to Dungeon Slice at all. If it does, then unfortunately we can't really use that as a reference tool, but I'm not sure. So I left it in with an asterisk. But anyways, trends here are largely the same. But you're going to notice I added one more column. No Garrote. What is this? Okay, it apparently does really good 1 and 2 target and then falls off dramatically after that. Well, it turns out if you tell the community that sims are not working for a specific build beyond some number of targets, aka we don't really understand how strong said build is in many target AoE, people are going to cook up all kinds of things, with this being one of these builds. So this is a variant of Force Induction, where, as the name would imply, we are not taking our Garrote talents. That's Shrouded Suffocation and Improved Garrote. And instead, we're going to pick up Double Shiv and Dashing Scoundrel. And what this does is it gives us a whole lot more boss damage at the expense of a crazy amount of AoE, or so we once thought. Right? This is a build that would almost have never been considered before because of how poorly it performed at higher target counts. But now, since we no longer know that to be the case, the floodgates have opened, pun intended, and there are all kinds of new cooks coming to the scene. So I decided to include this one because after hearing about it, I decided to try it for myself and can confirm that it does feel pretty good in some dungeons. So I'm not going to go into every single variant, but the floor has kind of opened. Now the way you play this build, like the name suggests, we don't really Garrote. In fact, we only ever press Garrote for energy. We want to stay above 150 in AoE. That's the benefit from Sanguine Blades. Outside of that, Garrote isn't a good builder. We would rather just Fan of Knives. I mean, we've taken all the damage out of Garrote, so we don't really want to press it. And it turns out that when you run Dashing Scoundrel, in AoE, you don't really have to lean into your bleeds for energy regen. Instead, your poison applications from pressing Fan of Knives give you a ton of energy in AoE. So instead, we're getting our 5 Ruptures out for Scent of Blood, and then just slam in Venoms, even more so than the previous Garrote variant. Additionally, with 2 Shiv charges, we play it kind of like we do in Raid, where we're going to Shiv twice in Deathmark, once for our Darkest Night plus Lingering Darkness combo, and then once more for your 1-minute Kingsbane. And what this build has been able to bring is very good boss damage, almost 8% higher than the lowest damage variant, which I do want to preface by saying that yes, that's a large relative difference, but a large percentage of a small thing is still a small thing. Acid Rogue single target still sucks. Even if you play no Garrote, don't expect to be like shooting to the moon. It also has good prio, maybe? We don't actually know. Intuitively, you're playing 2 charges of Shiv with Supercharger. I mean, surely you should do good prio damage in AoE, but we don't have a good way to check that. We can pull up Dungeon Slice sims on the hope that those results are more accurate. And we're going to see something like this. 3 mil overall, 576 to main target. This is similar to the normal Force Induction variant, slightly less overall. Maybe probably an insignificantly larger amount to your prio target. And then when compared with Hybrid and Bleed, we see Hybrid, the highest overall, slightly less to prio target. And then Bleed, also high overall, and slightly less damage to prio target. So these sims seem to reflect the idea that you're doing big main target damage, but is the overall value that's being returned accurate? It's hard to say. Another benefit to the build is that this is good when Garrote is bad. Okay, well, what do I mean by this? Why would Garrote ever be bad? Think of the first section of trash leading up to Waxbeard and the Darkflame Cleft. All the small laborers that come down and join your pulls. If you're trying to grow into your prio mob plus 2 other mobs and your Garrotes get sucked up by those laborers that die in like 3 seconds, that's not a great use of Garrote. If you're pressing Garrote, you want to apply it to a mob that will live sufficiently long. So in dungeons where you have lots of pad, unimportant adds, Garrote is less good. And so a build like this could maybe capitalize in that situation. But anyways, this is just one variant. I'm sure many others exist and maybe more will be discovered. But what can we say based on everything we've talked about so far? I made this graph, went through it, revised it a little bit, and I think I'm pretty happy with where it is right now. And I made sure to attach an asterisk to things that I am not confident in. But there are a few conclusions I feel safe in drawing, and I'm not going to go through every point on this table, but I'll summarize it now. And let's start with Bleed Build. Bleed Build has the highest consistent damage between pulls if we can get re-stealths in mass AoE. And when I say mass AoE, I'm referring to pulls of like 8 or more mobs. Now, this isn't something I'm able to sim, but from my experience playing the spec, having Shiv for every AoE pull and not being reliant on Kingsbane means that this build's damage profile seems to be very consistently high. So if you're doing a lot of like 7 to 12 target pulls, this build is really good for that. Additionally, Bleed is the least reliant on a prio target, which implies it's the best at spreading out its damage. So if you're playing with another prio damage class, like an Arcane Mage, like a Havoc Demon Hunter, maybe you consider running this build to try and spread out your damage so you don't overcommit to the prio mob. One caveat here is that when you have cooldowns up, namely with Deathmark, your prio is very high. And this is just a fundamental truth of playing Assassination. You have very good prio damage with any spec that you play. This build just happens to have the least of it, specifically outside cooldowns. Last thing I want to mention with respect to Bleed is that this build handles downtime the best. If ever you have to get off your target to solve some kind of mechanic, run out of a swirly, whatever it may be, and you're not able to maintain consistent uptime, bleed build loses the least because your damage is in your bleeds, right? Assuming you've already gotten them out, you're still realizing a larger portion of your damage than the other builds you can play. Next, Hybrid Double Vanish. This build is kind of the poster child for Assassination Rogue. You have the highest damaging cooldowns, which is especially attractive, namely an uncapped AoE. Again, don't really have a reliable way to measure this, but from experience, putting more of your damage into Caustic Spatter tends to scale better the more mobs there are, and this is both in the sense of just mass AoE and prio damage, okay? With Hybrid Double Vanish, you'll have the highest peaks with kind of the standard, normal assassination gameplay that people that have been playing the spec for a while have grown used to. Then, Force Induction builds offer a solution to our piss-poor single target. Now, it's not the solution, it's more of a step in the right direction, but if that's meaningful for you, that is something that this build does better than the other two. Additionally, you have the best main target damage. Now, I use the words main target here because when you think back to the Dungeon Slice sims, it uses the word main target to describe damage done to whatever you're hitting. So that much remains true. Whether or not you also have the best prio damage is a question mark because, well, we can't really sim it. It seems like outside of cooldowns, that is the case, but again, it's hard to say. Also, along the same train of thought, the trade-off is that you are supposedly losing AoE in favor of taking this greater boss and prio damage profile, which maybe is correct for your group if you're playing with classes that have just mass AoE, like maybe you're running with an Unholy Decay with a Balanced Druid. However, whether or not that's actually true, like whether or not this build does do much less damage than the other two in mass AoE is up in the air right now. All right, so those are kind of the strengths and weaknesses. Last thing I want to cover is that what comp you're playing will buff the different builds more or less. Most notably, Bleed build, being super heavily invested into physical damage, really likes physical damaging buffs. So maybe if you're playing with a warrior, if you're playing with a monk with Mystic Touch, I ran a Dungeon Slice sim here comparing Bleed and Hybrid, or actually all the builds. And you can see that Bleed ends up edging out the other two options in Dungeon Slice with these physical comp buffs. But also maybe you're playing with a VDH, right? And you have Chaos Brand, increasing the magic damage you deal. This buffs your nature damaging spells such that Hybrid ends up simming slightly better in this situation. So depending on the comp you play, one build may perform better for you. All right, speaking of, what do you play? Answer is up to you. I've tried to explain some of the pros and cons of the different build options, some of the playstyle benefits, how you play each of them. It depends on comp. It also depends on dungeon. I've touched on this briefly, but in dungeons where there's big mass AoE, maybe you lean towards Hybrid and Bleed, versus dungeons where there's a lot more single target. Think of like Theater of Pain, for instance. Maybe you lean in the direction of Force Induction. Additionally, it will depend on things like key level. Trying to get value from Hybrid and lower keys can be awkward, right? The lower the key is, the less likely you're able to get your full Kingsbane out. So maybe you lean into Bleed for that 10 vault key and sudden demise everything. At the end of the day, it's up to you. Play what you want, play what you like. My goal here is to try and teach you a little bit more about how the different builds work so you can make more of an informed decision. And finally, we end with some generic tips. Firstly, always hit off prio target for Caustic and hero talents, okay? That is to suggest whenever you mutilate to apply your Caustic, make sure you are attacking that mob. If you target swap for any reason, you are no longer benefiting from Caustic because Caustic is a debuff you apply to a target. You have to hit off that target to gain the benefit from Caustic. Then to similar effect, your hero talents are also applied to one target, meaning that you need to use finishers that affect that target to work through your Deathstalker's marks. And then inevitably, when you do have to target swap, try to do so on a Darkest Night so you're not leaving your hero talent behind. I'll showcase that real quick. So let's say I want to target swap. There's a Darkest Night. I'm going to mutilate a different mob to apply my Caustic. Use a max count point in Venom, and we are in. Next, avoid overriding empowered Crimson Tempests or Garrotes. This is because the percent damage modifier is a snapshot. So, namely, we have talents like Improved Garrote, This causes your Garrote to deal 50% increased damage and have no cooldown from stealth. So if I apply a Garrote from stealth, and then I override it with a Garrote outside of this window, I'm going to lose the damage on that empowered Garrote. Which means that once I use my empowered Garrote and it's applied, I want to let this tick through its full duration. Or if you're playing Subterfuge and you have a long Garrote window, you can actually refresh this Garrote just before it falls off, and I've snapshotted that empowered Garrote. At this point, I would let this tick through to 0 before I reapply a weaker one. Then you also have Crimson Tempest, which snapshots based on the number of targets it hits, which is to imply that, let's say your Crimson Tempest hits 5 targets, and 4 of them immediately die. The one target that stays alive will take the 100% increased damage for the duration of that ability. So let's say it's about to fall off, and there are 2 targets you could then hit. Ideally, you let the Crimson Tempest tick through and finish its duration before refreshing with the weaker 2-target Crimson Tempest. Next, Thistle Tea is bound to my Shiv, but I don't Shiv an AoE. What do I do? If you're playing Hybrid Double Vanish, you don't Shiv an AoE and pulls greater than 4 mobs. But if your Thistle Tea is bound to your Shiv, like what I talked about earlier when discussing raid talents, then you might not press Thistle Tea for a big chunk of the dungeon, at least until you maybe engage a boss fight. Which is, firstly, fine. If you want to use your Thistle Teas for single target, you're free to do so. But otherwise, if you're sitting at 3 charges of Thistle Tea, it is a good idea to press Tea separately for moments of importance, okay? Now, what I mean by this are big pulls in your cooldowns when you're doing the most possible damage. In this case, we're not really benefiting from the energy our Thistle Tea grants us, but we're utilizing the 13.6% mastery when all of our damage is at its peak, right? So in our cooldowns, this can be a good use. Or maybe you hold them for a damage amp. Really, the choice is yours. But in Mythic Plus, to prevent overcapping your Tea charges, it's probably a good idea to bind Thistle Tea separately. Next, Crimson Tempest and Caustic Spatter uptime are large. If you made it to this point in the video, you probably already understand that. However, I do want to reiterate it because I believe they are that important. These 2 abilities should be in your top 3 most damaging abilities pretty much every key, regardless of what build you play. So if you feel like your overall maybe isn't where it should be, take a look at your Crimson Tempest uptime, take a look at your Caustic Spatter uptime, and for the latter, make sure you're hitting off the target with Caustic on it. Then, last point, and finally, chain pulling sucks. But sometimes it's correct, aka the fastest solution to timing the dungeon. So do your best to play around it. As Assassination Rogue, we really want re-stealths. They're super good for our damage profile. However, that does not mean you are entitled to a re-stealth every single time you go into a pull. Sometimes it's just going to end up being the case that the fastest solution to timing the key, which is the end goal of why you're there in the first place, involves chain pulling into another pack. And to which I say, just try to play around it as best you can. Maybe hold your Vanish charge for a spot you know where a chain pull will happen, so you can then better prepare for that and play around it. But hopefully your tank isn't chain pulling when like the previous mob has 1% health. And that's it. No more slides. Thank you for watching. If you found this guide helpful, consider subscribing, drop a like. Here's my Twitch, check it out if you want. I usually raid and do keys. Cool stuff. I will see you in the next one. Peace.